It was a busy day at the airport, with travelers rushing through the terminal, trying to catch their flights. Among them was a man in his late 40s, standing calmly in line at the check-in counter. He wasn't wearing a uniform today, but the confident way he carried himself suggested there was something special about him. His name was Admiral Michael Carter, a highly respected officer in the Navy. Today, he was traveling in civilian clothes for a much-needed break after months of hard work. He stepped up to the counter and smiled at the young woman behind it. "I'd like to check in for my flight, please," he said politely. The woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes scanning the computer screen in front of her. She appeared to be in a hurry, probably trying to get through the long line of people. "You're booked in economy class," the attendant said without looking up from her screen. "Would you like to upgrade to first class?" Her tone was polite but indifferent. The Admiral paused for a moment, not surprised. He had traveled this route before and knew it wasn't always easy to get an upgrade. "Yes, please," he replied. "I'd appreciate it." The young woman, still not looking up, typed a few things on the computer. Then, after a few seconds, she glanced at him and shook her head. "Sorry, sir. There's no availability in first class at the moment," she said flatly. The Admiral raised an eyebrow, surprised by how quickly she dismissed his request. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've traveled this route often, and I've seen upgrades available." She sighed and glanced over at the crowd forming behind him, clearly eager to move him along. "I've checked, sir. You'll have to stay in economy," she said, sounding like she had already made up her mind. The Admiral nodded politely, accepting the situation without protest. He could understand that there were rules and limitations, but just as he was about to step away, he noticed a woman walking up behind him. She was dressed in expensive clothes, wearing a bright scarf and large sunglasses. Her body language screamed arrogance, and she didn't seem like someone who was used to waiting in line. "Oh, excuse me," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I've been waiting forever. You know, some people just don't belong in first class." She looked at the Admiral, her eyes scanning him up and down, a judgmental smile on her lips. "I really don't think you should be taking up space there," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The Admiral, taken aback by her comment, stood still for a moment, feeling the wave of frustration build up inside him. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered people who made assumptions about him based on his appearance, but it still stung every time. He wasn't used to being treated this way, especially when his years of service and dedication to his country should have earned him more respect. Before he could respond, the woman continued, raising her voice just enough for others around them to hear. "I mean, look at you," she said, giving him another once-over. "What kind of person would even need to sit in first class?" Her words cut through the air, and a few people nearby turned to look at the exchange. The Admiral took a deep breath. He had spent years learning how to stay calm under pressure, how to be patient even when things didn't go his way. But today, he found it difficult not to be affected by the rudeness and assumptions that were being thrown at him. He didn't respond to her comment immediately, instead choosing to focus on keeping his composure. As the Karen continued to speak, the tension between them grew, and the people around them started to whisper, curious about the situation. It was clear that something wasn't right, and the Admiral was about to find out just how far this confrontation was going to go. The situation grew even more uncomfortable as the woman continued to make rude comments about the Admiral's place in the airport. It wasn't just her words, but the way she looked at him, like he didn't belong. She kept talking, seemingly unaware of how many people were listening to her. "Do you really think they should let someone like you in first class?" she scoffed, her voice getting louder. She was clearly trying to make a scene, and the Admiral could feel everyone around them starting to notice. He took a deep breath, doing his best to stay calm, reminding himself that it wasn't worth getting angry over a stranger's ignorance. The airline attendant, who had been standing quietly by, seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but did nothing to intervene. She glanced at the woman and then at the Admiral, clearly torn between doing her job and avoiding further conflict. It was clear she wasn't used to dealing with situations like this, and her hesitation only made things worse. Meanwhile, the woman, still focused on the Admiral, kept talking as if she had a right to judge him. "Honestly, I don't know how people like you get into these kinds of places," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I mean, you've probably never even flown first class before. They should just reserve those seats for real customers." The Admiral remained silent, his gaze steady but his heart beginning to race. It wasn't the first time someone had looked down on him for no reason. But today, it was harder than usual to just let it slide. The way she was speaking to him was so blatantly disrespectful. It felt like an attack on his years of hard work, his service, and everything he had accomplished. Yet, he didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him angry. He tried to focus on something else, anything to block out the woman's words. The other passengers around them shifted uncomfortably, glancing over at the scene. Some seemed to agree with the woman, judging the Admiral by his appearance alone, while others seemed confused, unsure of what had just happened. The Admiral could feel their eyes on him, but he refused to let it shake him. He had learned a long time ago that staying calm in these situations was the only way to keep control. Finally, the Karen, as the Admiral had started to think of her, turned to the airline attendant and made another demand. "I've been waiting forever, and you need to do something about this," she said sharply. "I deserve first class more than anyone else here. He's taking up space that could go to someone who really deserves it." The words stung, but the Admiral wasn't going to let her have the satisfaction of knowing how much they hurt him. He had been through far worse in his life. Difficult situations, long deployments, and moments of doubt, but none of it had ever made him feel so small as this woman's casual cruelty did. He could see the attendant beginning to feel the pressure, and it was clear she was struggling to deal with the situation. The Admiral knew he had to keep it together, no matter what. He wasn't going to let this woman's narrow view of the world affect his sense of self-worth. He was a Navy Admiral. He had earned his place in the world. The Karen wasn't finished, though. She continued to talk down to him, louder now, as if trying to embarrass him in front of everyone. "First class is for people who can afford it, who belong there," she said, "not for people who think they're special just because they wear a uniform." The comment hit hard. It was as if she was saying that his accomplishments, his service to the country, meant nothing. It was hard to ignore, but the Admiral reminded himself that her ignorance wasn't his problem. He couldn't control how she saw the world, but he could control how he responded. The best thing he could do now was to rise above her words. As the woman continued to make rude comments, the Admiral felt the tension in the air grow thicker. The people around them had stopped what they were doing, some clearly uncomfortable, while others curiously watched the situation unfold. The Karen wasn't holding back, and every word seemed to chip away at the Admiral's patience. He could tell the airline attendant was unsure of how to handle the confrontation. She glanced nervously at the Admiral, then at the woman, before looking back down at the counter. It was clear she wanted to resolve the situation, but was hesitant, probably because she didn't know how to deal with such a demanding passenger. The Admiral stood still, his expression calm, despite the hurtful words being thrown his way. He had been in situations where people had tested his limits before, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was blatant disrespect. He had been through a lot in his career. The Admiral had seen war zones, faced challenges that most people couldn't imagine, and still, he had remained focused on his duties. But here he was, standing at an airport check-in counter, being belittled by a woman who didn't know the first thing about who he was or what he had accomplished. It took everything in him to stay composed. He wasn't about to get into an argument with her. He had learned long ago that arguing with people like this rarely led to anything productive. It only made things worse. Just as the Karen was about to make another sharp comment, the sound of footsteps interrupted the conversation. The Admiral turned his head to see a man in a pilot's uniform walking towards them. He had a confident, professional air about him, and the Admiral could sense that he was trying to assess the situation. The pilot, noticing the tense atmosphere, approached the counter and looked at the Karen and then at the Admiral. There was a moment of silence, and then the pilot spoke. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The Karen, seeing an opportunity to escalate the situation, immediately turned to the pilot. "Yes, there is," she said, her tone still dripping with disdain. "This man doesn't belong in first class. I've been waiting forever, and I'm not going to let him take my seat." The Admiral felt a sense of relief when the pilot turned his attention to the Karen. He wasn't sure if this would be the moment when the situation would escalate or de-escalate, but either way, he felt better knowing someone else was stepping in. The pilot looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The Karen seemed confident that she would get what she wanted, but the pilot wasn't backing down. He turned to the Admiral, recognizing him instantly. "Admiral Carter," the pilot said with a respectful nod. "I didn't realize you were flying with us today." The woman's eyes widened as she looked at the Admiral, who nodded politely, not needing to say anything more. The moment the pilot spoke, it was clear that the Admiral was someone of importance, and it shifted the power dynamic in the room. The Karen seemed to shrink, her boldness faltering as she processed the situation. She had been so sure of herself just moments ago, but now it was as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She stammered, unsure of how to respond. The Admiral stood still, his expression calm, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the air. The pilot's recognition had shifted the atmosphere completely, and now the Karen was the one who seemed out of place. The tension in the air shifted the moment the pilot addressed the Admiral by name. The Karen's confident, judgmental expression faltered as the pilot's words registered. The Admiral didn't have to say anything more. The pilot's recognition alone had completely changed the dynamic. The Karen stood frozen for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. She had been so sure of herself, so quick to assume the Admiral was unworthy of first class, and now she realized how wrong she was. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had been pulled away, leaving her unsteady and uncertain. The Admiral, meanwhile, didn't need to add anything to the conversation. His calm demeanor spoke volumes. He had endured moments like this throughout his career, and he knew that letting the pilot handle it was the right call. He didn't need to stoop to the woman's level. Instead, he focused on maintaining his own composure, the way he had been taught to do time and time again. His silence was loud enough. The pilot, still standing tall and professional, turned his attention fully to the Karen. "Ma'am," he began in a calm but firm voice, "this is Admiral Carter. He's a highly respected officer in the Navy, and his service to this country is something we all should be grateful for. I'm sure you can understand how important it is to show respect to people who have earned it." The Karen blinked, trying to process the pilot's words. She looked from the Admiral to the pilot, and then back to the Admiral again. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogance she had walked in with had completely disappeared. Instead, she seemed lost, her smugness replaced by a mix of embarrassment and confusion. The Admiral couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't needed to say anything to defend himself. His rank, his experience, and his character spoke for themselves. It wasn't about proving something to her. It was about standing firm in the face of ignorance and remaining composed in the face of unfairness. The pilot had seen it and acted accordingly, which made all the difference. The Karen now seemed to shrink under the pilot's authoritative tone. Her shoulders drooped, and she mumbled something under her breath, though it was unclear what she was even trying to say. Perhaps it was an apology, but it didn't feel sincere. Her words were almost inaudible as the weight of the situation settled in. The Admiral remained quiet throughout it all, choosing not to dignify her with a response. He had learned that sometimes the best thing to do was simply let others take the lead in situations like this. The pilot had done just that. The fact that he had recognized the Admiral and addressed the issue so calmly had done more than any words the Admiral could have spoken. The airline attendant, who had been watching from the sidelines, now seemed more at ease. She finally spoke up, her voice slightly hesitant. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir," she said to the Admiral. "We'll make sure you're taken care of and get you to your seat right away." The Admiral nodded, still maintaining his calm composure. He appreciated the apology, but he didn't need any special treatment. What mattered was that the situation had been handled with respect. The woman who had tried to belittle him had now been put in her place, and there was nothing more to be said. The Admiral knew it was time to move on. He turned to the pilot with a small smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. The pilot nodded in return, clearly understanding the weight of the moment. And together, they moved toward the first-class area, leaving the Karen standing behind, still processing what had just happened. As the Admiral walked away, he felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that sometimes the best way to deal with ignorance wasn't to fight back, but to let your actions, and the respect you've earned, speak louder than words ever could. As the Admiral made his way toward the first-class section, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of relief. The scene had settled down, and although the tension still lingered in the air, it was clear that the Karen had been put in her place. He wasn't one to seek attention or drama, but there was something satisfying about knowing that the truth had been revealed without him needing to argue. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about ensuring that respect was maintained. The pilot walked beside him, offering a few words of polite conversation to ease the silence. "I'm glad I could help," the pilot said, giving the Admiral a knowing look. "Some people just need to learn a little humility." The Admiral nodded, grateful for the support. "I appreciate it. It's not every day you get caught in a situation like that." He didn't mention it out loud, but it had been an uncomfortable moment. Even though he had handled it well, the idea of being judged based on something as superficial as his appearance or assumptions about his status still stung. He was proud of his service and his achievements, but it didn't make it any easier to face such unnecessary criticism. As they reached the first-class section, the Admiral was greeted by the flight attendants, who had already been informed of the situation. They seemed genuinely apologetic and eager to make things right, offering him a drink and asking if there was anything else they could do to make his experience more comfortable. The Admiral, ever the professional, declined the offer and simply thanked them for their attentiveness. It wasn't long before the Karen appeared at the front of the plane. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by an air of discomfort. She glanced around the first-class area, clearly searching for a way to save face. The Admiral noticed that she kept looking in his direction, but he didn't acknowledge her. He wasn't interested in prolonging the encounter. She had made her assumptions, and they had been proven wrong. There was no need to revisit it. The Karen finally approached the attendants, asking about seating arrangements. The Admiral couldn't help but overhear her request for an upgrade, her tone far less confident than it had been earlier. It was almost as if she was trying to downplay her earlier rudeness, but it was clear to everyone in the vicinity what had happened. The Admiral's presence in first class had made it impossible for her to act as if she were more deserving. She had been put in her place, and the awkwardness in the air was palpable. As she sat down in the section across from the Admiral, she tried to avoid eye contact, instead fidgeting with her bag and staring out the window. The Admiral, still calm, couldn't help but feel a little relieved that the confrontation had been resolved. He could now focus on his journey without having to dwell on the unpleasantness of the encounter. The flight attendants came by once more to check in, offering him a small smile. The Admiral gave them a polite nod in return, acknowledging their professionalism. It was clear they had done their best to handle the situation, and their kindness was a welcome change from the earlier tension. As the plane took off, the Admiral settled into his seat, looking out the window. He couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. The woman's words had stung, but he had maintained his dignity, and that was what mattered most. People would always make judgments based on appearances or preconceived notions, but in the end, The only thing that mattered was how he chose to respond. The flight was smooth, and as the hours passed, the Admiral felt the weight of the day's tension slowly begin to lift. There would always be people like the Karen, people who judged others without knowing the whole story. But he had learned long ago that the best way to handle them was with patience, grace, and confidence in himself. Today, he had done just that. And it felt good. As the plane soared through the sky, the Admiral settled into his seat, trying to relax after the stressful exchange. The hum of the engines was a comforting sound, and the slight turbulence barely registered as he closed his eyes. He was grateful for the quiet, as it gave him time to reflect on the events of the day. He had never been one to let things bother him for long, but today had been different. The judgmental comments from the woman had struck a nerve, and it had taken all his willpower to remain calm. He had dealt with prejudice before, but something about this situation had made it harder to brush off. Despite the discomfort, he knew that handling it the way he did had been the right choice. There had been no need to stoop to the woman's level. He had learned long ago that some battles were best fought with silence and dignity, and that was exactly what he had done. He had let the pilot handle the situation, and in doing so, the truth had come out without a word from him. It had been a simple act of respect, and that had been enough to put an end to the confrontation. As the Admiral gazed out the window, he couldn't help but think about how often these types of moments occurred. People, for whatever reason, sometimes felt the need to belittle others to make themselves feel more important. It wasn't always overt or intentional, but it still happened. And sometimes it came from a place of ignorance, like in this case. He wondered if the woman truly realized the impact of her words, or if she would simply forget about it as soon as the flight ended. He looked over at the Karen again. She was sitting quietly now, but there was a noticeable difference in her posture. She had gone from arrogantly walking up to the counter, certain of her place, to sitting back in her seat with a humbled expression. She wasn't making eye contact with anyone, and her previous confidence seemed to have evaporated. The Admiral didn't take pleasure in seeing her uncomfortable, but it was clear that she had learned something today, even if it was just a small lesson in humility. A flight attendant came by with a drink cart, and the Admiral politely accepted a glass of water. He took a sip, letting the cool liquid soothe his throat. The attendant smiled at him and made a small remark about the weather, but the Admiral wasn't really paying attention. His mind was still on the encounter. He had done his best to let it go, but the memory of the woman's dismissive comments still lingered. The plane continued its journey, and the Admiral found himself thinking about how much he had learned over the years. Serving in the Navy had taught him many lessons about leadership, about resilience, about the importance of standing up for what was right. But perhaps the most important lesson he had learned was how to stay calm in the face of adversity. People would always judge him, sometimes for things beyond his control. But it was his reaction to those judgments that mattered most. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. The rest of the flight was quiet, and the Admiral felt a sense of peace wash over him. It had been a difficult day, but he had handled it with grace. He had let his actions speak for themselves, and in the end, that had been enough. As the plane made its way to its destination, the Admiral felt ready to face whatever came next. There would always be challenges, but he knew how to meet them head-on with dignity and self-assurance. Today, he had proven that to himself once again. As the flight continued smoothly, the Admiral found himself thinking less about the uncomfortable interaction at the airport and more about the journey ahead. He had always been someone who could compartmentalize difficult situations, and today was no different. He had faced far worse in his career after all, but something about this encounter had left him with a lingering feeling. He wasn't sure if it was the woman's rude behavior, the way she had assumed he didn't belong, or the strange way the entire situation had unfolded. Regardless, it had made him think about how easily people could judge others based on appearances. The thought made him pause. He had always believed in the strength of human character, the idea that people should be judged by their actions, not by how they looked or where they came from. And yet, in this moment, he couldn't ignore the discomfort he felt about being judged so harshly. It wasn't about being angry or resentful. It was more about the realization that people still had so much to learn about empathy and respect. The Admiral leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the armrests, and looked out the window again. The sky was a soft, hazy blue, and the clouds were fluffy, stretching out in every direction. It was a peaceful sight, one that reminded him of how small all of this, every interaction, every challenge, really was in the grand scheme of things. His mind wandered back to his service in the Navy, to the countless hours he had spent in demanding situations, always pushing forward, always leading by example. But this incident, this small moment of prejudice, had somehow made him reflect more deeply than he expected. It wasn't just about his personal dignity either. It was about the responsibility that came with being a leader, someone others looked up to. He had seen how people in leadership positions could change the world around them, not through force or power, but through kindness, patience, and understanding. Perhaps that was what he needed to remind himself of today. There was always going to be someone who didn't understand, who passed judgment without thinking, but that didn't mean he needed to let it affect him. He could choose to rise above it, as he always had. A soft voice broke his thoughts. It was the flight attendant again, checking in to make sure he was comfortable. He smiled at her politely, thankful for the distraction. She asked if he needed anything, and for a brief moment, they chatted about the flight. Her tone was warm and friendly, a stark contrast to the earlier coldness he had experienced. It felt good to be treated with kindness, and the Admiral appreciated the simple gesture. As the flight neared its destination, the Admiral felt a sense of quiet contentment settle over him. He wasn't sure what he would face when he landed, but he knew he was ready for whatever came next. He had handled the challenge with composure, and that was all he could control. The woman, the Karen, had learned a valuable lesson about respect today, even if she didn't fully realize it. The Admiral had made it clear that no one, no matter their assumptions, had the right to judge someone else based on looks alone. There was a time for standing up for what was right, and today had been one of those times. He didn't need recognition or praise. He just needed to know that he had done the right thing. The world was full of challenges, big and small, and the Admiral had faced this one with dignity. That was what mattered most. As the plane began its descent, he felt at peace, ready to continue his journey, knowing that he had navigated this one with the calm strength that defined him. The plane descended gently, its steady hum now mingling with the soft whispers of the passengers preparing for arrival. The Admiral looked out the window once more, seeing the patchwork of land below. It was a beautiful sight, the kind of landscape that reminded him of his travels, of all the places he had been, all the people he had met. But today there was a quiet reflection in his mind. He had experienced something at the airport that, while small, had stayed with him longer than he expected. The woman, the Karen, had made assumptions based on nothing more than her own limited worldview, and yet, in that moment, her assumptions had been challenged. Not through confrontation, not through harsh words, but simply by the presence of someone who had earned the respect that came with years of service, sacrifice, and leadership. The Admiral had never been one to boast about his achievements or flaunt his rank. He didn't need to. But today the truth had spoken for itself, and in the end, it had been enough. The thought lingered with him as the plane touched down, the wheels making the smooth contact with the tarmac. The Admiral couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the strength to stay composed, grateful for the small victories that often went unnoticed, and grateful for the opportunity to make a difference without saying a word. He didn't need anyone's approval. His actions had already spoken for him, and that felt more fulfilling than anything else. As the flight attendants began their preparations for disembarkation, the Admiral gathered his things, his mind still processing the events of the day. He had never been one for drama, and he certainly hadn't expected to be involved in a confrontation at the airport. But the moment had reminded him that life was full of surprises, And sometimes those surprises came in the form of a person who thought they knew everything about someone based on nothing but appearances. When he stood up to leave, he noticed the Karen again. She was still in her seat, but now there was a noticeable difference. She seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally. Her earlier attitude had evaporated, replaced by something more subdued. She kept her eyes to the ground, avoiding eye contact with the Admiral as he passed by. The Admiral didn't look at her in a judgmental way, but there was something satisfying in knowing that the power of dignity had worked as quiet magic. He had let her experience a small taste of what it felt like to be judged. Perhaps it would be enough for her to reconsider the way she interacted with others in the future. As the Admiral walked down the aisle toward the gate, the thought struck him that he had learned something valuable today as well. He had known, of course, that not everyone would understand him or appreciate him, but he hadn't truly realized how often people let their assumptions cloud their judgment. It wasn't just about the Karen. It was about the way society sometimes rushed to conclusions without ever taking the time to understand the full picture. The Admiral had experienced that all too often in his life, but today he realized that the best way to challenge those assumptions wasn't through confrontation, but through steady resolve and quiet strength. He smiled to himself as he made his way through the terminal. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, but he was ready. He had handled this situation with grace, and he would continue to face whatever came next with the same calm assurance. As he reached the exit and the cool air greeted him, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The day had been long, and the encounter had tested him. But in the end, he knew he had done the right thing. The world was full of people who might not understand, but he didn't need their approval. All he needed was to continue living by his values, respect, patience, and the knowledge that who he was had been earned, not given. And with that, he walked into the next chapter of his journey, ready for whatever came next.